We're going to start, and I'm looking here at people who are at home, and if you're at home, maybe you can just type your name in so I know you're here. Welcome back to part 2 of our seminar on the intellectual history of Zionism. I just wanted to do a very quick recap of last week before we look at the thinkers that I sent out in the assignment for tonight. So last week we looked at Leo Pinsker and Vladimir Jabotinsky. They were separated by about 60 years. So they were writing in two very different time periods, but they both, I think, are appropriately grouped into a particular school of Zionist thinking, political Zionism, nationalist Zionism. And we looked at how both Pinsker and Jabotinsky in different ways focused on a few different ideas related to what Zionism meant for them. One was the idea of creating a refuge, creating a safe haven, creating an asylum for Jewish people because of the dangers of living in the diaspora. Pinsker saw the horrors of what was happening in Eastern Europe in the 19th century. Jabotinsky was seeing what was happening in terms of fascism and the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany. And the essay that we read from him was written, very close to when the Holocaust really began. So both of them were very focused on the idea of creating a safe haven for Jews to get out of Europe and to live in a land of their own. The second thing both of them talked about in different ways, Pinsker was a physician, so he talked about the sickness of the diaspora, that the diaspora itself was not a healthy context within which Jews could live or should live. Jabotinsky echoed some of that. They used words like decay, like abnormal. They talked about how Jews could not truly be fully actualized in an environment like that, where there's constant anxiety. And when, to use their words, the Jew is constantly looked at as a ghost, as a specter, as the wandering Jew, as an alien. And finally, they talked about the importance of Jews becoming quote-unquote normal like all of the other nations, like the Serbs, like the Turks, like the Armenians. The Jewish people, and I'm going back to Pinsker now, are one of the only peoples of the world who don't have a homeland. They have many motherlands, but they don't have a fatherland. They don't have a home of their own. And so the thrust of a lot of the political Zionist writing is on normalizing the Jewish people, getting them into a homeland, even if it's not the state of Israel of today. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them were open to alternative territories, Uganda or elsewhere. So some sort of geographic territory of their own. Jabotinsky was very much focused on independence and on empowerment, not being reliant on an external power. So having a Jewish military, having Jewish police, having Jewish civil servants, being a fully functioning nation state like all the rest. And that was a major thrust of their thinking. Tonight we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at two, possibly very briefly, 3 different Zionist thinkers who take a very different approach, although there are going to be echoes of what they have to say in their writing as well. But these writers tend to take more of a cultural or spiritual approach to Zionism rather than a straightforward political one. Although there's certainly crossover and cross-pollination among all of them. The Jewish people, not only today, but certainly back then, had a wide range of opinions. Sometimes they disagreed with each other vehemently. There were differences in culture. The French Jews, had tensions with the Eastern European, with the Russian Jews, and There were religious Jews and secular Jews and Jews on the left and Jews on the right and Jews who were Marxists and Jews who were nationalists. And so we're going to see probably some echoes here, but the thinkers I picked for tonight deliberately offer kind of a different rationale for the need and importance of a Jewish homeland. So that's what we're going to look at now. Let me just see if there's anything here. I see Barbara and Howard and Harriet and Marcia. Okay, good. I'm glad you guys are here. So let's start with Echad Ha'am. And Echad Ha'am is, as it was taught to me when I was in rabbinical school, is a very interesting thinker. Even though he was born in the Russian Ukraine, he grew up, unlike Pinsker and Jabotinsky, he grew up with a very strong Jewish education. And some of these Jews, some of these Zionists, like Herzl, like some of the others, did not have a very strong religious education. Echad Ha'am did, and his actual name was Asher Tzvi Ginsburg. He actually had a very strong Jewish education. I'm on page 249, the introduction in my book to his life. But then he was introduced, as he became older, to the Haskalah. The Haskalah is a Hebrew word for basically enlightenment. And the Haskalah movement in Europe was a movement by Jews, some of whom were rebelling against their religious background, some of whom were just educated in Western traditions, but they created a very rich and diverse cultural milieu for Jews in terms of writing Hebrew novels, and literature, music, art. And so when Echad Ha'am was introduced to some of these ideas of the Haskalah, he really started abandoning the religious aspect of Judaism that he had grown up with. He was much more interested in universal ideas, universal values, and less on particularistic Jewish religious concepts that he had grown up with, studying the Talmud and the Torah. He was galvanized by certain anti-Semitic acts, again, as he got older, and he wrote his very first article called "This Is Not the Way," and he signed it, he was 33 years old, he signed it Echad Ha'am, which means Echad, like Echad the number one, Ha'am, Am, Echad, Am is people, so Echad Ha'am means one of the people. So his pen name from that point forward became Echad Ha'am, one of the people, and it was his way of identifying with the totality of the Jewish people and not just with being a Russian Jew. He advocated that the work in Palestine needed to be done slowly and with great care. His focus was on the moral and cultural aspects of the Jewish national revival, less so on the political and nationalistic side. And some of his core ideas, which we're going to look at right now, focused on the idea of not just creating a refuge for the Jews, that's Pinsker, that's Jabotinsky and others, but a Jewish state. And there's a big difference between creating an asylum, a safe haven, a territory where Jews can live, and a state that actually has a truly Jewish character, which for him relates to culture, a national culture. He talks a great deal about the importance of the Hebrew language and Hebrew culture and the soil as well. And he talks a lot, and we're going to look at this now, about the idea of Israel being a kind of epicenter, a kind of spiritual and cultural center of the Jewish people that emanates throughout the world and sort of nourishes and feeds diaspora communities throughout. So even though, as we're going to see, he did not feel you could be fully evolved and fully actualized as a Jew in the diaspora, he did not negate the diaspora. He did not say that we need every single solitary Jew to leave the diaspora and come to Israel. And he argued that one could really feed the other. So let's just look at, I really want to focus on one essay in particular, but I just want to briefly look at the first one called The Law of the Heart. And in my book, I want to just look at page 255. This is a book where he talks about Judaism being a people of the book. You know, they're in some ways for him, and again, this is his rebellion against the religious orthodoxy that he grew up with, he felt that too many Jews, at least those who studied their religion, were slaves to the book. They were not generating their own organic culture, and whatever culture they were exposing themselves and their kids and their grandchildren to was a culture rooted from centuries in the past. And he advocated to really have a Jewish renaissance or renaissance. Jews needed to create their own culture in alignment with universal values. Again, even though it's a little bit different than the nationalists, so that in some ways, at least culturally, Jews could be like everybody else. And they didn't really truly have their own national culture living in these diaspora communities. So toward the end of this essay, The Law of the Heart, on page 255, he says, this is the end of the second paragraph. There can be no complete answer to our question until a new and compelling urge toward normalization, so here's that word normalization again, springs up among us from within. It's got to be from within, from our own Jewish life, and is communicated to the younger generation through education and literature, so that it may fuse with the humanism of Haskalah, that Jewish enlightenment, and prevent the latter from overwhelming and obliterating the Jewish mold. He didn't want the wider universal culture to destroy the particular nature of Jewish culture. It was a dance that they had to do together, but it was very important for him that this be centered on our Jewishness, and that the universal ideas of the wider culture only serve to complement that. And he then goes a little bit further. He talks about this concept of chibat Zion, love of Zion, which was a very prominent idea in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The idea of chibat Zion, love of Zion, lots of different groups emerged with this as a core principle. And again, it had to do with the importance of Jewish consciousness, Jewish culture. There's less discussion here, like Jabotinsky, about having a Jewish military, Jewish police, Jewish civil servants, Jewish judges. The focus is much more on culture, language, art, literature, etc. Aleph Dalet Gordon's going to say something different, but that'll be a little bit later. He says toward the end of the second to last paragraph, when he's talking about chibat Zion, love of Zion, it stands for a Judaism which shall have as its focal point the ideal of our nation's unity, its renaissance, and its free development through the expression of universal human values in the terms of its own distinctive spirit. So chibat Zion, love of Zion, his expression for Zionism is that Jewish culture has to be the focal point. It has to be a unifying principle for Jews in Israel and in the diaspora. He is very comfortable having a small group of Jews in Palestine. You could call his version of Zionism elitist. I don't know if I would personally call it elitist, but he was very comfortable, almost like the Aspen Institute, in terms of generating ideas. You don't necessarily need a lot of people to have great impact if you're generating culture, if you're generating ideas, if you're generating great works of literature and art. And that was sort of his version of chibat Zion. And again, even though it embraced universal human values, like freedom, like community, like, the embrace of reason, they had to be subordinate to the distinctive Jewish spirit. So he was very clear in his writing that even though Jewish culture needed to break free of traditional Judaism, the universal values that he thought were really important for Jewish culture to remain dynamic and vibrant and relevant to people living in his time, they still had to be subordinate. They still had to be secondary to the distinctive Jewish spirit. The Hebrew language, Jewish practices, et cetera, et cetera. Even though he broke away from traditional Judaism, he still recognized the value in some of these rituals and rites. I want to move on because I just wanted to touch on this briefly. The real essay that I think highlights his ideas is called, and that's what I'll focus on tonight, it's called The Jewish State and the Jewish Problem. That's where he really lays out his thinking. Before we get to that, really quickly, there's another essay in here called Flesh and Spirit, where he talks about the prophets, he talks about the Pharisees, he talks about ghetto culture, and how important it was, but how it's kind of past its time. When he wrote, I think this one was from 1904. But he says one of the great things about Jewish history and Jewish culture is that it didn't try to separate body and spirit. It recognized that to be a fully actualized Jew, you had to have not only the Jewish spirit, but you had to have the Jewish body too. Without a community, without a nation, all you had are these ethereal ideas that are not going to last. And that even though the body is meant to uplift the spirit, you can't have one without the other. And he talks about how the prophets advocated for that, and the Pharisees or the rabbis advocated for that, but that we're at a moment now in 1904 where it just doesn't work anymore, and they need to find a new solution to encapsulate the spirit and the body. And that's going to lead to his take on Zionism. So if you go to 262, The Jewish State and the Jewish Problem, or actually 263, he makes a distinction here between political Zionism and Chibat Zion. And at this time, there were more than just two, but there were a lot of different approaches to creating a Jewish homeland and what that homeland would look like. And the nationalists, the Zionists, like Herzl, like Pinsker, like others, were very focused on a political solution to this material problem. How do we get the Jews out of danger and into a place where they're safe, and into a place where they're normal, and into a place where they can be empowered and fully actualized? He takes a little bit of a different angle here, and he says on page, let's jump to I'm on 263 and 264. He sort of offers a criticism of political Zionism here, and says that while many of the political Zionists advocate that the Jews leave the lands in which they live, that's not going to be enough. And if you go to 264, the second paragraph, he says, "The truth is bitter, but with all its bitterness, it is better than illusion. We must admit to ourselves that the ingathering of the exiles," that's a phrase from the Amidah prayer, where we actually pray. Does anyone remember how many blessings we say during the Amidah prayer in the morning? 18. That's why sometimes it's called the Shemona Esrei. There are 18 blessings. We ask God for health and well-being and repentance. And one of the things we ask God for every morning, except on Shabbat, when it's only 7, is the ingathering of the exiles. And what he's saying here is the ingathering of the exiles is unattainable by natural means. All you Zionists, political Zionists, who think all the Jewish people are going to come to Uganda or Palestine or wherever it is, it's never going to happen. And he says, we may by natural means someday establish a Jewish state. It is possible that the Jews may increase and multiply within it until the land is filled with them. But even then, the greater part of our people will remain scattered on foreign soils. So this is, his observation, 1904, and in his estimation, as important as a Jewish homeland is, for all sorts of reasons he's going to get into, including the refuge idea, to think that all Jews are going to go to that place is an illusion. That's never going to happen. And probably what will happen is, even if a large number of Jews go to Palestine, go to Israel, there's still going to be a majority of our people spread out all over the world. That's the case today, but this was his observation in 1904. And then he says, to gather our scattered ones from the four corners of the earth is impossible. Only religion, with its belief in a miraculous redemption, can promise such a consummation. So whether you agree with him or not, he obviously knows his material. He grew up Orthodox and traditional, and he's a realist. He's a pragmatist, and he's basically saying that let's focus on creating a homeland. Let's focus on the creation of a national culture, but let's not be delusional. Let's not think that all the Jews, or even the majority of Jews all over the world, are going to come to Israel. That might be a religious aspiration, that might be messianic, but that's not what we should be spending our energy on. And he seemed to think that some of the political Zionists were advocating that. People can hear really well at home, but only if you hold up the mic. So who's got the mic right now? Oh, let me give it to Jacob. Would you give it to Jacob? Thank you. And just speak right into it. You can do it from your seat.
In what language did he compose his essays? Was it Hebrew?
I'm not sure. And I don't know if his, I think, is that on?
Is it on?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I don't know which language he wrote them in, and I'm not sure if every essay was in his language. That's a good question. I should know that. I'll try to find out. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, let's go on where we really get into the meat of his essay. So he starts off as a pragmatist, and he says, let's build a homeland, but let's not kid ourselves in thinking that all Jews are going to come here. And then he says, how are we going to solve the material problem of the Jewish masses in the lands of the diaspora? The material problem for him is the poverty, the danger, the terrible living conditions they have. How are we going to solve that material problem? And he basically says that even if we establish a Jewish state, we're not going to solve that problem. He says, it is indeed beyond our power to solve it once and for all. So he has no illusion that even if there's look today. We have a Jewish state, it's sovereign, it's powerful, it's strong, but there are lots of Jews all over the world, in particular in the former Soviet Union. And I traveled there in the early and mid-90s, and there are Jews living in dire, terrible conditions. So just because we establish a Jewish state doesn't necessarily mean it's going to solve the material problem of all of the rest of the Jews around the world. However, there are two problems that Jews face. This is 1904, and I would say it's the same today. There's the material problem, but there's also the spiritual problem. And that's the problem that he as a writer and as a Zionist thinker is really interested here. He says, the only basis, the real and only basis of Zionism is to be found in another problem, the spiritual one. Now, he makes a distinction between Jews who live in the West, meaning Western Europe, and Jews who live in the East, I think presumably Russia, Pale of Settlement, Ukraine, where my grandparents come from. And on page 265, again, he sort of makes a jab at the political Zionists. And Herzl was, I wouldn't call him an adversary, but he had issues with Herzl and some of the others like him. Who knew nothing about Judaism, who didn't speak Hebrew, who were thoroughly assimilated, and who, in his view, didn't have the kind of credibility that he thought leaders of this movement should have. So, on page 265, he talks about how many of these Western Zionists, like Herzl and others, felt that the Jewish state should create a society organized exactly after the pattern of other states. Be normal. Have a military, have police, have a judiciary. Just, again, whether it's Uganda or Palestine, just create a normal nation state like all of the others. He says that for people like that, the very existence of the Jewish state will raise the prestige of those who remain in exile, and their fellow citizens will no longer despise them. Well, good luck. I mean, look today at Israel, and he's criticizing this. He's saying that that's also an illusion, to think that if the Jewish people have their own state, with their own sovereignty and their own power, it's gonna raise the prestige of Jews who live in the diaspora, and everyone's gonna love us. He's criticizing that. And then he also says at the end of that page, it is not the attainment of the ideal that he needs. Its pursuit alone is sufficient to cure him of his spiritual disease. So even if we don't succeed in establishing a Jewish state, just the pursuit of it, just the effort to build one is going to help to cure the spiritual illness that so many Jews in the West, who are assimilated, who don't know anything about their tradition, who can't really seem to fit in, that's going to help them. He's being very critical of this. He doesn't think that's ultimately what the value of a Jewish state. And he says, the first line of the last paragraph, this is the basis of Western Zionism and the secret of its attraction. So people like Herzl and others are attracted to building a Jewish state for exactly that reason. They're assimilated. They think that a Jewish state is going to solve all of their spiritual problems, but it's not. And then he points out that Chibat Zion originated and developed in a different setting. And he goes on to talk about Jews who live in the East, not the West, who are not as assimilated, who live in ghettos or in shtetls, or in enclaves, in different countries, and how for them, their challenge is both material and spiritual, but in a different way. The material is obvious. That's the reason my grandparents came over here from Lithuania and from Ukraine. Poverty, famine, pogroms, et cetera, et cetera. That's the material problem. So the Jews in the East were in worse shape than Jews in the West in terms of not having good educations, in terms of not having affluence, and in terms of dealing not with polite society anti-Semitism like in London and Paris, but with overt violent anti-Semitism like in the Ukraine and Belarus and Russia, where they would come after the Passion plays and kill you. So the Jews in the East had two problems, not just one. They had the material problem, which Jews in the West didn't have as much, but they had a spiritual problem too, but it was different. They weren't assimilated. They weren't yearning for something more than just being a Frenchman or a German. These Jews had a good grounding in their Jewishness. But he says here in paragraph 3, the Eastern form of the spiritual problem is absolutely different from the Western. In the West, it is the problem of the Jews, meaning they're assimilated, they're acculturated, they don't know anything about their Jewishness. But in the East, it is the problem of Judaism. So there's a problem of Jews and there's a problem of Judaism. And he says in the first line of the last paragraph there, it is not only the Jews who have come out of the ghetto, Judaism has come out too. So he's basically saying it's not enough just for Jews to move to Palestine. We don't need to just get the Jews out of the ghetto. We need to get Judaism out of the ghetto. And we need to create a Jewish identity, a Jewish culture that is not just grounded in ideas and teachings from thousands of years ago. We need to create our own. And, the Haskalah is part of it. The Jewish Enlightenment is part of it. Hebrew language, Hebrew art, Hebrew scholarship ideas. But that contact with modern culture has to be subordinate to the Jewish framework that is going to ultimately inform it. Go ahead. You can keep the mic with you. Yeah, and then just hand it to whoever's next after you. But it doesn't have to be up here. Just whoever.
Oh, okay.
And then I'll see if there's a question here. Yeah, it's good.
So Echad Ha'am seems to be arguing that culture comes first before the state. And,
a little closer. Culture comes first before escape.
Yeah, and I would argue that, in fact, if you look at it historically, it's the state that came first and provided the umbrella in which the culture could develop. you can't come up with a universal Jewish culture for Jewish communities scattered in the diaspora. So my thought was he had it backwards. You don't develop a universal Jewish culture and then go find a state. You create a state which provides the welfare and security of its inhabitants so that they can thrive and create whatever that culture will be.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. There were a lot of people who disagreed with him, and he didn't even necessarily think a state, the way we think of a state, was necessary, at least at first. He was content to have a smaller Jewish presence in Palestine, whether it's living in colonies, like German colony in Jerusalem, or kibbutzim, agrarian settlements. We haven't gotten to that yet, but he's much more comfortable having a small population in Israel creating this incredible culture that would emanate outward than with having the nation state that you seem to be saying would provide the framework and the protection, from which that could grow. And certainly, people disagreed with him and along your lines. A question at home from Barbara Lustig: why did my grandparents come to America instead of going to Palestine? I don't know. I'm not sure. My grandfather went through Ellis Island, made his way to Milwaukee. My mom's dad, my dad's father, came through Galveston from Lithuania, made his way up to Chicago. So, Barbara, it's a good question. They're not around anymore, but I could check with my mom and dad as to why they came here rather than Palestine, and that, I'm guessing, is probably the case with a lot of us here at home or in this room whose parents were born Jewish or grandparents, and everyone has their own reasons for what they do. I have some friends whose parents, I have a friend in Chicago whose dad was born in Argentina, moved to Israel, fought in the War of Independence in 1948, and then came to America. So people do all sorts of different things. All right, let's go on with the Chada Am. I'm on page 267 now. And here's where this page, it really gets to the heart of his point, his vision of Zionism, cultural Zionism. And he says at the top of the page, in our time, culture expresses itself everywhere through the form of the national spirit. In exile, Judaism cannot, therefore, develop its individuality in its own way. You need to have a homeland. You need to, this is sort of, Jacob, to your point a little bit, you can't have a national spirit unless you have a nation. And if Jews are spread out in different diaspora communities all over the world, how do you create a national spirit? You might be able to have an Ashkenazi spirit or a Sephardic spirit or Bukharan spirit, but how do you create a national spirit without a national homeland? That's what he seems to be saying here. And then he says, and so, I'm in the second paragraph, it seeks, he's talking about Judaism now, it seeks to return to its historic center, where it will be able to live a life developing in a natural way, to bring its powers into play in every department of human culture. He's at a point now where I think he's beyond the whole Uganda idea, and recognizes the importance of the Jewish ancestral homeland. That's why he's talking about returning to the historic center. The historic center is the land of Zion. That's why they call it Chibat Zion, love of Zion. And he talks about the creation of a great national culture, one that will contribute to the future and not just in the past. And then he says something really interesting here. Again, it's 1904. It does not need an independent state, but only the creation in its native land of conditions favorable to its development. So he's happy to be an incrementalist, to be a gradualist. He's not saying that there shouldn't be a Jewish state. He's just saying, as he's writing in 1904, to create a national culture in the historic homeland, we don't have to have a full-fledged, quote-unquote, normal nation state. Only the creation in its native land, so in Israel, of conditions favorable to its development. So there's a picture of him, I think it's in here, no, I think I saw it online, where he's talking to one of the major figures of the Bezalel Art School. Has anyone been to Bezalel in Jerusalem? It's a great art school, and it goes back long before the State of Israel in 1948. That's a prime example of what he was talking about in terms of the creation of a great Jewish culture. Bezalel, the art school named after the Bezalel figure who built the tabernacle in the book of Exodus, was around long before 1948 and was helping to produce great Jewish culture that would hopefully have impact around the world. So he's saying very clearly that we don't need an independent state, at least not yet, in order to create a great Jewish national culture. So I guess, Jacob, you probably would not see eye to eye with him on this. But then he goes a little bit further, and he says, what we really need is a good-sized, who knows what a good-sized means, but a good-sized settlement of Jews working without hindrance in every branch of civilization. So, what does that mean? 5,000, 10,000, 100,000, 200,000, and how do you live without hindrance if you don't have an army, if you don't have the police? All of these are all very complicated. To me, that doesn't take away from his insight and his ideas, but he's basically saying, as long as we have a good chunk of Jews living in Palestine, working without hindrance in every major branch of civilization, from agriculture and handicrafts to science and literature, this Jewish settlement, which will be a gradual growth, so he's not a revolutionary, he believes in incrementalism. I lost my place. So after gradual growth, will become in course of time the center of the nation, wherein its spirit will find expression, pure expression, and develop in all its aspects to the highest degree of protection of which it is capable. And here is this is his most famous idea, in my opinion, as it was taught to me. Then from this center, the spirit of Judaism will radiate to the great circumference, to all the communities of the diaspora, to inspire them with new life and to preserve the overall unity of our people. When our national culture in Palestine has attained that level, we may be confident that it will produce men in the land of Israel itself who will be able, at a favorable moment, to establish a state there. One which will be not merely a state of Jews, but really a Jewish state. So even though he's an incrementalist, and even though he thinks we can produce great national culture even without an independent nation state, he's still saying hopefully that's what will happen. It may not happen immediately, but he's saying if we're patient, if we wait for that to happen, we're not just going to create a state of Jews. We're not just going to plop down 3 million Jews, from Russia into Uganda, who are going to be speaking Yiddish or Russian or whatever it is, or Jews going to Palestine from France or Germany speaking French or Russian. That's just a state of Jews. What he wants is a Jewish state. And by Jewish state, I think he means more cultural Judaism than religious Judaism. Some people have argued that even though in many ways his thinking seems a little antiquated, he doesn't do enough justice to the political side of Zionism, in many ways his idea of Israel as this kind of cultural spritz, it's like a hub and spoke model. So Israel is the hub, and all the different spokes are the diaspora communities in Russia, in Argentina, in North America, in the UK, and in France, where have you. But the center is in Israel. And some people have observed that in many ways his vision is actually right. Why do we have birthright Israel? Why do we send so many kids between the ages of 17 and 20, 18 and 25? I don't remember exactly. But why is it that we send them to Israel to have this incredible experience and then to go back to their diaspora communities all fired up and hopefully more engaged with their Jewish identities, with Judaism, with Israel, etc.? Because in many ways, Echad Ha'am's vision is what has happened. There's a lot of great Jewish scholarship outside of Israel. We have some great Jewish studies departments here in the United States. But there is an enormous amount of Jewish culture. Television, I mean, go to anyone watch Netflix? I mean, watch on Netflix, Fauda and Shtisel and all that. I mean, television, movies, science, technology, art, music, literature. I mean, Israel in many ways has produced a national Jewish culture that is emanating to all the different diaspora communities around the world. Why do we on Sunday mornings teach modern Hebrew to our kids at religious school? Why do we have Israeli food? On Yom HaAtzmaut, on Israel Independence Day, even if we are living in Buenos Aires. So in some ways, his vision of Israel being the hub of a national Jewish culture, sending energy to all the diaspora communities around the world has kind of, come to be. And in that way, I think, he was very onto things. Yeah, Richard, would you get the mic from Jacob? And I only want to spend about 5 or 10 more minutes on Ahad Am, and then I want to go to Martin Buber.
So when I think about this in a practical way of life today in America, I think about people who are Jewish but don't want to come to a synagogue, but they want to go to a JCC, they want to go to Jewish movies, they want to have lox and bagels, all this kind of stuff. And I still see this kind of division of a-religious but culturally connected. And it hasn't gone away. If anything, it's probably even greater now than it used to be.
Yeah, I think that for the majority of Jews, at least in North America, cultural Judaism seems to have much more of a pull than religious Judaism. Look at affiliation rates at synagogues. Look at who shows up on Friday night. Look who's here right now. So, although this is not a religious experience we're having, in some ways it is. We're studying in a synagogue, and study is a Jewish religious principle. So I think that's right. Culture seems to predominate over religion, and that seems to be what Ahad Ha'am is advocating, and yet not totally. So if you look at the very last line of 267 and the very first line of 268, he says, political Zionism cannot satisfy those Jews who care for Judaism. So he's making a little distinction and saying, if all you want is a state of the Jews, a refuge, an asylum, a normal nation like everyone else, Pinsker, Jabotinsky, Herzl, that's not going to be enough for Jews who care about Jewish culture and Jewish religion. So he still sort of seems to have some emotional connection to Jewish religiosity, although it doesn't really come into play overtly in the writing that I've studied from him. But let's look, and we'll close with what he says underneath this. He says, the secret of our people's persistence is, as I have tried to show elsewhere, that at the very early period, the prophets taught it to respect only the power of the Spirit and not to worship material power. Now, he says earlier, as I mentioned, that you need the mind and the body, the spirit and the body. You can't have a national Jewish culture, you can't have a Jewish people if you don't have a body to protect the spirit, which is why he advocates a homeland, which is why he's a Zionist. But he says that the prophets, and he's right, as a student of prophetic literature, they were wary of material power. And they said, it may be a necessary evil, but don't worship it. Don't worship political power. Don't worship material power. Don't worship might. And he says that is a secret to our people's persistence, so that even when they were living through periods where we didn't have any material power, we were still able to survive, and in my view, still in the 2,000 years of diaspora life, 2,600 if you include the Babylonian exile, Jews made some very important contributions to the world. He goes on and says, a political idea which is not grounded in our national culture is apt to seduce us from loyalty to our own inner spirit and to beget in us a tendency to find the path of glory in the attainment of material power and political domination, thus breaking the thread that unites us with the past and undermining our historical foundation. So, if the political ideal, the Jewish state, is not grounded in national culture, if it's just about territorial gain, having land on both sides of the Jordan, if it's only about, transactional relationships, about advancing your agenda, realpolitik, whatever it happens to be, advancing your interests, he's not that interested in that. He thinks that it's seductive, but that the real genius, the real power of Jewishness, of the Jewish people, is that thread that connects present with past, with the past. Otherwise, we're undermining our historical foundation. So he believes in the past, but he doesn't believe we should make a clean break from it. And then he has this little jab, again, at same paragraph. He says, almost all our great men, and here he's talking about Herzl and some of the others who wrote during his time, are spiritually far removed from Judaism and have no true conception of its nature and its values. So again, he's making a distinction between some of these Western Zionists who were completely assimilated, who didn't know any Hebrew, who didn't know any Yiddish, who had no Jewish education of any meaningful sort. And he's basically saying they don't have credibility to do this. He's saying I have credibility because I grew up traditional. And so he says, so that if we follow their model, the model of political Zionism, rather than the Chibat Zion, love of Zion, which is more national and cultural, then in the end, the Jewish state will be a state of Germans or Frenchmen of the Jewish race. And he says we have, even now, a small example of this process in Palestine. I'm not sure what he's referring to. There's a neighborhood in Jerusalem called the German Colony, which was founded by German Jews who spoke German to each other. He might have been referring to them. I'm not sure. Let me say one more thing on page 269, and then we'll leave Echad Ha'am. Last paragraph. While Zionism looks to the Jewish state to furnish a remedy for poverty and to provide complete tranquility and national glory, that's the material problem, Chibat Zion knows that our state will not give us all these things until universal righteousness is enthroned and holds sway over nations and states. This kind of messianic religious vision. He goes on and says, Chibat Zion begins with national culture because only through the natural culture and for its sake can a Jewish state be established in such a way as to correspond with the will and the needs of the Jewish people. So the core idea for me is the focus on creating a Jewish state, not just a state for Jews, creating a hub and spoke model, which I think in many ways has happened, where the center of world Jewry, the center of world Jewish culture, is in the historic homeland, but it emanates outward and feeds in a nourishing way. He was not entirely pessimistic about the diaspora, even though he felt that to be most fully actualized, you did need to live in the native land, and that to only look at a Jewish homeland in terms of power and in terms of a safe haven was not enough. We needed to go further. So he's writing this in 1904, and he's trying to push Zionism in a little bit of a different direction. And he's an important thinker. Not everyone agrees with him, but I think this way of looking at Israel, I think, turned out to be prescient. And here we are 20 years later, and I think some of what he had to say, has really come to be. So let's jump to Martin Buber, who wrote later, and then I do want to just at the very end talk about Aleph Dalet Gordon. Buber is on page, here we are, page 451. Now, some of you may know Martin Buber from his very famous book, I and Thou, Ich und Du. He wrote in German. He and Franz Rosenzweig, another very important German Jewish thinker, did a German translation of the Torah. I don't know if they ever finished it completely. But he's a very important theologian and mystic. He was not a religious man, but he was steeped in Jewish teachings. And I have lots of his books in my library at home. But he, like Ahad Ha'am, was not a political Zionist. He was not a nationalist. He was wary of nationalism, in fact. And his focus was much more on the cultural and the spiritual aspects of Zionism rather than just power, nation state, asylum, safe haven. When he arrived in Palestine, he did a lot of important work in Israel. He established an adult education center called the Lehr House in Frankfurt in the 30s. I know there's a Lehr House in Berkeley, I think. I don't know if it's still around, but they named themselves after this. And for, I think, about a decade or 15 years, it was like a golden age in Frankfurt of these Jewish intellectuals led by Buber and Rosenzweig, just, incredible lectures and, seminars and publications. But he saw the writing on the wall, and he left for Palestine in the late 30s, left Germany. And when he arrived in Palestine, he met Judah Magnus, and in 1951 became a professor at Hebrew University, where I studied for my junior year abroad in the late 80s. And they became, colleagues. Judah Magnus was a Reform rabbi who had a big pulpit in Manhattan and left, became the first president, or I think chancellor of Hebrew University, and then ultimately became a pacifist. And Buber and Magnus both advocated for a binational state of Jews and Arabs. We're not going to really get into that. That, of course, never happened and probably never will. But Buber was a proponent, as were others at this time, like Judah Magnus, of a not a two-state solution, but a binational state. He, unlike some of the other Zionists who were very focused on creating the new Jew, strong, powerful, working in the fields, independent, heroic, almost like socialist realism, the kind of art you saw in the Soviet Union. There were a lot of socialists, a lot of Marxists who were Zionists. Buber said that the heroic was not in power and in physical strength. The heroic was in the dimension of morality and of spirituality. That was the thrust of his writing. So we're going to just look at a couple of his essays. Turn to page 454. I just really want to quickly look at this from 1934. It's called The Jew in the World. And this is actually one of those lectures that he delivered at the Lehr House in Frankfurt in 1934. And that attracted a lot of, people like us, well-educated Jews who lived in Frankfurt, who probably were not religious at all, certainly not Orthodox, but you would come to get, very high-level lectures about Jewish topics. So this is one of the lectures he gave there. And on page 454, he again brings up the idea we heard in Pinsker and a little bit with Jabotinsky, that part of the reason that Jews are vilified in the diaspora is because no one knows what to do with us. We're ghosts, we're specters, we're wanderers, we're the eternal wandering Jews. We don't have a homeland of our own. We're weird. No one knows what to make of us. And he says here in his lecture, in the second paragraph, we ourselves know very well. He acknowledges this. He has no problem acknowledging that some people think of us as ghosts, as specters, as kind of weird. And he says, we ourselves know very well that we are not specters, but a living community. And so we must ask ourselves what our non-classifiability really signifies. So unlike Pinsker, unlike Jabotinsky, unlike most of the political Zionists, like Herzl and others, who think that that's a problem, that that's abnormal, that the fact that we are not normal like everyone else, that we are looked at as a people that is not categorizable, we're not classifiable, no one knows really what to make of us. And that's the problem. That's why we need to move to Israel, create a nation state, become quote unquote normal, like everybody else. And then anti-Semitism, if it doesn't go away, at least it won't be a problem as much anymore, at least for those who live in Israel. Buber does something very different, which I love. He says, we must ask ourselves what our non-classifiability really signifies. He doesn't run away from it. He doesn't say it's a problem. He embraces it. So he says in the second to last paragraph, from any viewpoint other than faith, our inability to fit into a category would be intolerable as something counter to history and counter to nature. That's Herzl, that's Pinsker, that's Jabotinsky. We're ghosts, we're specters, we need to be normal. But then Buber says, but from the viewpoint of faith, and he's not orthodox, he's not traditional, but he is a very profoundly well-educated and spiritually grounded Jew. He says, from the viewpoint of faith, our inability to fit into a category is the very foundation and meaning of our living avowal of the uniqueness of Israel. So he doesn't run away from the fact that Jews are difficult to classify, difficult to categorize. No one really knows what to make of us. We're totally unique compared to other peoples of the world. An arguable point, but I think it's a good point, that we're very unique. And instead of saying this is a problem, this is a sickness, this is something we need to quote unquote cure, he embraces it. He says that is the foundation of the uniqueness of Israel. So rather than running away from our uniqueness or trying to mitigate it in some way, because it leads to some bad outcomes, we need to embrace it. And then he goes on and says at the very end, on 457, and then I want to get to Hebrew humanism, which is the essay I really want to focus on. And Jacob, I was saying while you're out, this is from a lecture he gave at the Lehrhaus in Frankfurt in 1934. Before he moves to Palestine. So he says at the very end of this essay, there is no reestablishing of Israel. There is no security for it save one. It must assume the burden of its own uniqueness. It must assume the yoke of the kingdom of God. So it's very poetic. It's not, if I were to be a pragmatist or a cynic, I'd say, well, what does that mean? This is really poetic. What does it mean to assume or embrace the yoke of the kingdom of God? But because I like poetry and because I like Buber, what I love about this is that he seems to be saying, you can't, just by having a strong army and defined borders, that's not going to give you security. At least that's what he says here in 1934. What you need to truly reestablish Israel and to be secure in a spiritual sense is to take on what he calls the burden of your uniqueness, and not run away from it, not say, I just want to be normal like everyone else. He's saying that's not the goal of Judaism. That's not the goal of the Jewish community. Our goal should not be to be like everybody else. Our goal should be to embrace our uniqueness, embrace the fact that we are hard or difficult or impossible to categorize, and just take that as our mantle. That which makes us unique, and then take on the yoke of the kingdom of God. Become a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. You shall be holy, for I am holy, Book of Leviticus, etc., etc. While he's not a traditionalist, he does come, like Ahad Ha'am did, out of a Jewish educational framework. So some of what he's saying here is coming from biblical sources. And, some of the criticisms of Buber are that he's too poetic. What does that mean to be a nation of priests, to be a holy nation? But for him, just having a strong army and well-defined borders is not enough. We have to embrace our uniqueness. Striving for normalization, Pinsker, Jabotinsky, Herzl, is the exact opposite of what his Zionism seems to be advocating. Kathleen and then Richard.
In what way do you say that he is a mystic?
Well, he was very interested in Hasidism, and he wrote a book called Tales of the Hasidim, which I've drawn from a lot. I and Thou, which talks about the relationship between God and humanity in almost a mystical way. He's just often thought of as a more mystical thinker who's more interested in the relationship between God and us, and having God ground all of our relationships with one another so that we can all have I-thou relationships, so that our relationships are not just transactional. And he was less interested in Torah and mitzvot. And in fact, as I said, he was a professor at Hebrew University. He was not an observant Jew by any stretch of the imagination, but he was an author and a teacher, and he was steeped in Jewish knowledge. But his orientation tended to be a little more mystical than normative, mainstream. Richard?
Well, I thought you were referring to that quote in the Bible, Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh.
Yeah.
But then
That
I'm
is-
thinking more, I think all of us are faced with this decision. Do we want to assimilate? Do we want to become part of, just the regular Saturday morning stuff that everybody else does? Or do we want to actually have,
Just hold it a little closer to your
have a
mouth.
pride in ourselves and be having enough courage to actually say, I'm Jewish, I'm going to be different, I don't care what these other people are doing. And I think we all kind of, in our own ways, have to come up with some kind of decision as which way we're going to go with that.
Yeah, I think we're all faced with that, and I think we're faced with that decision more in the diaspora than in Israel. I think the challenge in Israel is not about being born into Jewish culture. All Israelis are. That was Echad Ha'am's vision. The challenge for a lot of Israelis that I know, some who live here, some who live there, their challenge is the religious aspect. I know plenty of Israelis who speak fluent Hebrew better than I'll ever speak it, who serve in the military, who pay their taxes, who work in a myriad of professions, but who know next to nothing about Torah or about rabbinic literature or about any number of other things that arguably are one of the cornerstones of what it means to be a Jew. And that raises the interesting question of, are we ever going to reach a point where there's going to be a difference between being an Israeli and a Jew? Is the Israeli identity going to ever be fundamentally different than the Jewish identity? Probably not. All Israelis are, well, I shouldn't say all, because there are, I think 1.5 million Palestinian Israelis, but all Israeli Jews are Jews, but not all Jews in the diaspora are Israelis. But the Israeli identity certainly in many ways is very different than the Jewish identity in the diaspora. Let's go on. Harriet Spitz just had something here about where did the idea of Uganda come up? Was there any concern for the people already living there? I don't know. Many of the Zionists were colonialists, just like a lot of Brits who lived in the 19th century. I don't know specifically why Uganda was the place they picked, but Jacob, if you know, would you just speak into the mic? But it was, Harriet, it was because that particular school of Zionism was much more interested in just finding a territory that they could call their own, and they didn't care so much because they didn't really grow up steeped in the Jewish religion that it be Palestine. It could be anywhere. Go ahead, do you know why Uganda specifically?
Yeah, as a practical matter, the British controlled Uganda in East Africa, and the whole thrust of Herzl and his fellow Zionist leaders was to find a homeland, and they were grasping at straws, and it seemed like a possible connection because the British, who they were courting for support, controlled East Africa.
Okay, thank you.
And that was, by the way, that was very controversial at the Second Zionist Congress? I forget where that idea came up, and it was voted down by the delegates.
Yep, thank you. And that's why when we read Jabotinsky's speech to the Brits last week, I think from 1937, he mentions Uganda, and he says, give us the same rights of the British who live in Uganda, and they were trying to court the British. Okay, let's go on to the essay that I think really encapsulates Buber's thinking. Buber was not as influential as Echad Ha'am in terms of Israel, but he's an important thinker, I think, nevertheless. So This is from 1942 on page 457, and he talks about the factor of spiritual power. That same return to our origin must accompany the material factor. So he's sort of reinforcing what he had said earlier. It's not enough just to focus on political power. We also have to focus on spiritual power for the Jewish state to really be a Jewish state, not just a state of Jews. That has echoes of Echad Ha'am, who wrote 40 years before him. But if you jump to 459, this kind of gets into the heart of what he means by Hebrew humanism. And he says, Hebrew biblical humanism goes as far as he must. Wait a minute. He who has been reared in our Hebrew biblical humanism goes as far as he must in the hour of gravest responsibility, and not a step further. He resists patriotic bombast, which clouds the gulf between the demand of life and the desire of the will to power. That's Nietzsche. He resists the whisperings of false popularity, which is the opposite of true service to the people. He is not taken in by the hoax of modern national egoism, according to which everything which can be of benefit to one's people must be true and right. So like Echad Ha'am, he's very wary of nationalism. The flag over there, the flag over there, Buber doesn't want that. Patriotic bombast, parades, military parades, marches, I don't know if it was the Irgun, the Stern Gang, they had uniforms, they had medals, they had flags. That was important to that particular group. Buber hated that kind of stuff. Anything that smacked of nationalism and bombast, he did not have any patience for. And so what he seems to be saying here is that if you embrace Hebrew humanism, what he calls Hebrew humanism, an embrace of the spiritual dimension rather than only the material dimension or the political dimension, that can cloud our thinking, and that can make us, that can lead us to be taken in by what he calls the hoax, the fake news of modern national egoism. He's writing in 1942, fascism has flowered, in the 30s and early 40s. He's seen the dark side of nationalism. We've seen the dark side in this country of nationalism. And so what he seems to be saying is that nationalism can lead to a people's thinking that whatever benefits them is true and right. It may not be objectively true or right, but if it helps us, if it gives us more land, if it gives us more money, if it gives us more power, if it gives us more influence, therefore it's right and good. That is a transactional way of looking at the world. That is an egotistical way of looking at the world. That is, for Buber, a nationalist way of looking at the world. So for him, in this concept he's calling Hebrew humanism, that is anathema. Whether you agree with it or not, that's his position. And I think it's a compelling one to me, having seen the dangers of nationalism. He goes on a little bit later in the second paragraph where he says, I am setting up Hebrew humanism. Now he's very clear, more even than Echad Ha'am was. And he's writing 40 years later. I am setting up Hebrew humanism in opposition to that Jewish nationalism which regards Israel as a nation like unto other nations and recognizes no task for Israel save that of preserving and asserting itself. So here he's being very clear, and he's saying, I don't want Israel to be normal like everyone else. I don't want it to be just another modern nation state focused on advancing its own agenda, focused on just preservation, self-preservation, self-assertion, dominance of neighbors, etc., etc. That's not what he's advocating with Hebrew humanism. And then he says, the Zionist movement must decide either for national egoism or national humanism. So here he is in 1942 saying, he couldn't know that Israel will become independent in 1948, but of course, the tide was gradually beginning to turn, and he's saying, they're at an inflection point. They need to decide, what do they want? Do they want Israel to be grounded in nationalism, or do they want it to be grounded in what he calls Hebrew humanism? And then he says here, one second, Jacob, echoes of that first essay where he says, don't run away from the fact that we're not easily classifiable or categorizable. Let's embrace our uniqueness. That's what makes us who we are, going back 6 millennia. So he says here at the bottom of page 459, Israel is not a nation like other nations, no matter how much its representatives have wished it during certain eras. Israel is a people like no other, for it is the only people in the world which, from its earliest beginnings, has been both a nation and a religious community. So again, Buber is saying we are or the Zionists of his time, at least of a particular school, are misguided if they think that trying to become normal like other nations is going to lead to security, going to lead to a Jewish state. We have to have that spiritual and moral component. And if those values, if the spiritual and moral values of Judaism run afoul with the interests and policies of the nation state, then the latter needs to be subordinate to the former. Jewish values need to trump Zionist values. That's what Buber seems to be saying. Did you want to add something?
Well, I want to ask a question.
Okay.
Buber's writing his essay on Hebrew humanism in 1942, but he lived for almost another 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
So what, if you know, what happened to his thinking 20 years later after he had experienced the Jewish state for 12 or 15 years? Did he see things any differently?
I don't know, Jacob. It's another good question. As I said earlier, I'm a student of Zionism, not a scholar of Zionism. We'd have to bring in a professor for that. But I think he held on to his binationalism. I think that he had problems. I don't remember what year he died, but I think, I'm sorry? 65, okay, so before 67. I think he probably had problems with some of the different governments and prime ministers, but I honestly don't know exactly if his views changed in a fundamental way. I suspect that he became more like a lot of people as they get older, and especially if they're professors. I think he focused a lot on his scholarship. And some of what he did toward the end was controversial because he went back to Germany and a lot of people thought he shouldn't do that. I think he received an award or something. But that's a good question. I'm not quite sure if his thinking changed over time.
Thank you.
Yeah. Really quickly, and then I just want to spend 5 minutes on Aleph Dalet Gordon. He says on page 460, Israel was and is a people and a religious community in one. And it is this unity which enabled it to survive in an exile no other nation had to suffer, an exile which lasted much longer than the period of its independence. He who severs this bond severs the life of Israel. So to separate the peoplehood dimension from the religious dimension, and by religious, Buber doesn't mean orthodoxy. He means something much more abstract, I think. The spiritual and moral values of Judaism is what I think he means when he uses the word religious. To sever that linkage, that unity that has kept us alive for 2,000 years, for many, 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 many more years than we ever had sovereignty in Israel, you sever the life of Israel. So that's why, again, like Achad Ha'am, he wasn't interested in a state of the Jews. He was interested in a Jewish state. And for Buber, that meant a state whose policies and values were in accord with those of Judaism, loosely defined. Okay, let's go to page 462, and then we'll end with Buber here. Our only salvation is to become Israel again, to become a whole, the unique whole of a people and a religious community. And then he talks about some of the political Zionists of his day who say that all we need to do is establish the conditions for a normal national life and everything will come of itself. He says this is a fatal error. We do, of course. So he recognizes it. Of course we need, a state where people can feel safe. We need the conditions of a normal national life. But these are not enough. Not enough for us, at any rate, those who subscribe to this Hebrew humanist worldview. We cannot enthrone normalcy in place of the eternal premise of our survival. So I group them together because, like Echad Ha'am, they're offering a critique of political Zionism. They are pointing out the limitations of looking at Israel as a refuge or an asylum and not also looking at the values that serve as the anchor to that homeland. And both of them are critiquing the idea of normalcy being the highest goal of Zionism. Buber is saying it's not about normalcy, it's about embracing our uniqueness. Let's very quickly, it's 8:30. I said this was sort of extra credit, but I do want to just point out one quick thing about Aleph Dalet Gordon, because he had a tremendous amount of impact on the labor Zionist movement in Israel and the kibbutz movement and the Labor Party in some ways. Aaron David Gordon, page 368. In Hebrew, it's Aleph Dalet Gordon. So if you turn to page 368, all I really want to point out here, there's a lot more, but you can read it on your own, is the fact that his focus was on labor. And he thought that without physical labor, Jews were never going to be, going back to this idea, a normal people, a fully realized people. We needed to return to farming. So many of the Jews of his time lived in cities. They were merchants. They did other things, but they didn't really work the land. And for him, and this was not unique to him, a lot of people who wrote at his time in other cultures believed in the importance of working the land. Even in this country, there was a romance about agrarianism. That's Thomas Jefferson. That's earlier than A.D. Gordon. But he really focused on returning to the land, returning to farming, and that the Jewish people can only become whole again by living the life of nature. So for him, nature was the cure to the problems of diaspora life. He says on page 373, at the top of the page, labor is not only the force which binds man to the soil and by which possession of the soil is acquired. It is also the basic energy for the creation of a national culture. So again, some echoes of Echad Ha'am here. If you don't work the land, if you don't populate the land, some different Israeli governments have talked about facts on the ground and establishing settlements in order to kind of make that a fait accompli. What Gordon is saying here is that you have to work the land in order to possess the land, in order to acquire the land. And he says that is also how you create a national culture. And he goes on at the bottom of this page to offer a take on national culture like Echad Ha'am, but totally different. Echad Ha'am is, in his view, and this is my interpretation, more of an elitist. Echad Ha'am says very clearly, we don't need all the Jews to go there. It's only enough if it happens gradually, only some small colonies, maybe some farming communities, and let's create great high-level culture, art, literature, music, scholarship. Gordon is saying something really different. He says at the bottom of the page, culture is whatever life creates for living purposes, farming, building, and road making. Any work, any craft, any productive activity is part of culture and is indeed the foundation and the stuff of culture. So he's not highbrow. In some ways, this might be a critique of Echad Ha'am. I don't know if it's deliberate or not, but he says that is what sustains the higher expressions of culture in science and art, creeds and ideology. And he talks about the example of milk and butter. You can't make butter without curdling milk, and working the land in Israel is going to produce the milk, the land of milk and honey. And from that milk, we will produce the butter, the Betzalel Art Institutes, the Israel Philharmonic, Silicon Valley near Tel Aviv. But if you don't have the land, if you don't work the land, this was him. I mean, I know a lot of Israelis, they don't want to work the land anymore. The kibbutz movement is in big, big trouble. But at least when he wrote, and in a more idealistic, romantic phase of labor Zionism, and sometimes it was Marxist, sometimes it was socialist, not always. This is how it works. So Aleph Dalet Gordon became sort of a guru and an inspirational force for the early labor Zionists, for a lot of people in the kibbutz movement, for a lot of Israelis who agreed with him. I mean, one of the things I did, and then we'll just close with one or two final questions or comments. I did what's known as a Yam LaYam hike, a sea-to-sea hike, when I was studying at Hebrew University. We started at the Mediterranean. I think we were near Nahariya or something, and I think it took us 3 days. We walked across Israel, the northern part of Israel, by foot, and ended in Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee. And I'll tell you, if you want to see feel what the land is like, you got to hike it, you got to walk it. And so Aleph Dalet Gordon was saying, you can't do that if you live in Paris or London or Moscow. We need to be in our native land. We need to work the soil. That is how we will not only possess it, that is how we will be strengthened by it. And so, I know we're not doing him justice, but A.D. Gordon, Aleph Dalet Gordon, he lived in Tel Aviv at the end, but he was a major influence on labor Zionism, which is not a very powerful, political movement right now, but for decades it really was. And he was one of the key figures. So let me just wrap with this, and then I'll just take a final comment or two. Hopefully, by looking at these five thinkers, Leo Pinsker, Vladimir Jabotinsky, Ahad Ha'am, Martin Buber, and Aleph Dalet Gordon, and there are dozens more. And I encourage you to look at them on your own, or maybe I'll teach some more of them in the future. This is a very diverse movement. There's a lot of cross-pollination. Some are on the left, some are on the right, some are religious, some are secular. Even within the religious camps, you have Orthodox and you have non-Orthodox, and some are capitalists, some are Marxists, and somehow together, some were in favor of diplomacy, some were in favor of direct action, but somehow all together, whatever mistakes they made then or make now, Israel became an independent sovereign state in 1948, and I think it's in part because of the diversity of voices that were advocating for this. And I think you probably needed all of them for Israel to come into being. Go ahead.
Well, in your opening remarks, and then just now, you emphasize this diversity of opinions of Zionisms. Is there now a spectrum of Zionisms? Because
Can you just hold it up to your mouth?
Your criticism initially was of any anti-Zionist not taking into account these diverse opinions. Is there such a thing now, or does it just start with Netanyahu and go right from there?
No, I mean, Israel is still a very diverse very diverse country, lots of different voices, lots of different political parties. I think, in my opinion, what has happened, at least in this country, but also in Europe, is we had a government in Israel, more right-leaning, more nationalist, Netanyahu, who wound up alienating a lot of people because of his views and because of its views and its policies. And I think what happened is, and what is happening, is a lot of people now are very critical of Israel because of it. And whatever you think of Netanyahu, I think the problem I have with all of these critics of Israel, even though there's a lot to criticize, just like there's a lot to criticize in this country, is that they view the Netanyahu administration as Zionism. And that is only one expression of a Zionist political party. There are many others. Yitzhak Rabin, how many years was he in power? I don't remember exactly, before he was killed. I don't know how many years he was, but he represented a very different kind of a prime minister.
I mean, is that still true, or has that...
Is what still true?
That there are those other currents that are strong enough to make some influence, because reading about it, you don't get that idea that there's any strong peace movement anymore, that the society is not
From
divided?
all I know is what you know from reading essays and articles. I don't think the peace movement is as strong as it was when I studied and lived in Israel. Shalom Achshav was a big deal. Peace now. I don't think that's such a big deal anymore. And I think a lot of Israelis at this point are more resigned to the fact that, the only real long-term solution is probably a two-state solution, although some reject that, and, on the more extreme end. Anyway, all right, it's 20 to 9. I really appreciate all of you coming. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll study more together. But again, if you take nothing from this seminar, I hope you'll take that Zionism is not one thing, just like democracy is not one thing. And there's a lot of room for all of us under the big tent of Zionism as there is under the big tent of Judaism. So see you soon. Thank you.